clutched in calloused hands, face unreadable under the lines of sun and hard labor. Jedediah Boone, cowboy, drifter, rumored outlaw, or worse depending on which saloon you drank in, wasn't what anyone imagined when they thought of a husband. And certainly not for Clara Whitmore, the preacher's orphan daughter raised by the town's women like a china doll too delicate for the dirt of real life. She was supposed to marry Charles Hensley, the banker's polished son with hands softer than butter and ambition sharper than his shoes. Not a man who lived out beyond the ridge with cattle, solitude, and silence as his only companions. But Clara had never cared for polish, and she'd long stopped dreaming of a love approved by drawing rooms and dinner parties. What she saw in Jedediah wasn't what they saw. She saw the scar that ran down his left wrist, half-healed and hidden under the cuff. She saw the way he spoke only when necessary, but always gently, like words were something sacred. She'd watched him, in the weeks before this day, bring bandages to the widow McCallan's boy, feed scraps to the churchyard strays, and tip his hat at every grave, even the unmarked ones. Something inside her had stirred, not with passion, not yet, but with a stillness that whispered, "Here is a man who won't break what he holds." The town called her mad. Said she was throwing her life away. That Jedediah would never give her anything but grief and wilderness. That love didn't grow where lawlessness had taken root. They called him a vagabond, a thief of hearts and horses, and they said, with sneering certainty, that he would leave her before the first frost. But he didn't leave. He offered his name and everything in his pocket, which wasn't much. Just a silver coin flattened by a train, a worn Bible with the cover torn off, and a promise. I ain't got land like Hensley. Ain't got fine boots or a father to stand beside me. But I've got hands that don't lie, and I'll build something for you. I swear it. And Clara, with eyes too clear for 22 and a heart stitched together by years of knowing what loneliness tastes like, took that vow. Because she wasn't marrying for fine things. She was marrying for stillness, for truth. They rode out that evening. No send-off, no celebration. Just the sound of her dress rustling on the saddle and the slow clip-clop of his mare under the growing dusk. Behind them, silence pressed heavy, every gaze from town drilling into her back like nails, as if trying to fix her into place. But Clara never looked back. Their first night at the ranch was a test of patience and resilience. Jedediah's shack, if you could call it that, sat crooked on a knoll with only 3 full walls, a roof patched with hides, and a door that creaked like it had a grudge. She stepped inside with no complaint, set down her bag, and began sweeping. Not because she was a woman, but because she was tired of waiting for life to happen. He watched her, unsure, like a man half expecting her to bolt. "It ain't much," he said. "It's honest," she replied. That night, sleep was shy. Coyotes howled in the distance. Wind rattled the shutters. And between them lay a space of quiet too loud to ignore. But they didn't speak. Instead, Jedediah stoked the fire and laid a blanket near it for her, choosing the floor for himself. When dawn broke, golden and wild, Clara stepped outside and saw the land he had promised to tame. Nothing but endless prairie, cracked earth, and hills that sighed when the wind passed through. It wasn't beautiful. Not yet. But something in her chest ached at the sight. As days passed, routine settled in like dust in an old barn. She mended what could be mended. He built what could be built. He brought her wildflowers in a tin cup, not every day, but when they bloomed. She taught him how to read Psalm 23 without stumbling. He taught her how to saddle a Mustang without getting thrown. But behind every sunset, a shadow waited. It came in the form of a letter, carried by a rider from town. Sealed in blue wax, its script too careful, too smug. It was from Charles Hensley. Asterisk, I can still offer you more than that drifter ever will. A real house. A real future. It's not too late to come home. Asterisk. Clara folded the letter slowly, pressing the edges with her thumb until they creased like old wounds. Then she placed it in the stove and watched it curl into ash. Jedediah never asked what it said. But that night, he held her hand a little longer than usual. And still, the wind blew. The dust danced. And the prairie, stubborn and wide, waited to test their vows. Because love, like land, had to be earned. And the real storm hadn't come yet. The days passed not in comfort but in commitment. Mornings began before the sun could stretch its light across the horizon, and nights ended with two weary souls sitting side by side on a splintered porch, their silence more intimate than any touch. Clara learned quickly how to mend fencing wire, how to wring out water from a dry creek bed, and how to spot a storm brewing by the curl of leaves and a sudden hush in the trees. She wore the same two dresses in rotation, hands stained from soil and wood, but never once did she complain. Her eyes no longer sought beauty in lace or polished shoes. They found it instead in calloused hands that held her steady. Jedediah, too, was changing in quiet ways. He still said little, but his eyes lingered longer on her, softer when she wasn't looking. His steps slowed when they walked, just enough for her to match his stride. He built her a new shelf from an old wagon axle, crafted a rocking chair that creaked only on one side, and carved her name into the post of the front door. Clara, rough, uneven, but full of devotion. Still, something lingered on the edge of their fragile peace. A tension beneath the surface like wind pressed tightly inside a sealed jar. It wasn't just the land that was hard. It was the knowledge that they were watched. Not by beasts but by men. Men from town who rode too close to their fence line, who let their laughter carry just a bit too loud when they passed, who spat near the well as if marking it for themselves. They didn't believe Clara belonged with him. And they believed it even less when she didn't come crawling back. One morning, while Jedediah was riding north to fetch grain, Clara spotted a rider approaching from the east. She set down her washtub, wiped her hands, and reached for the rifle Jedediah had taught her to use. She didn't aim it, just held it across her lap as she sat on the porch. The rider stopped a few paces from the gate. It was Harlan Dobbs, a rancher's son known more for his mouth than his muscle. His hat was too clean, his boots too polished for someone who claimed to work the land. He didn't dismount. Just tipped his hat and leaned forward in the saddle. "Evenin', Miss Whitmore," he drawled. "Heard you was livin' out here now." She said nothing. "You know, folks say things. That Boone ain't fit for a preacher's daughter. That maybe you got caught up in a spell. But me? I think maybe you're just lonely out here, and you forgot you got choices." Clara's gaze didn't waver. "I made my choice." He smirked. "Ain't too late to unmake it." She stood slowly, rifle still in hand. "You done?" Harlan's smirk faded. He spat once, then turned his horse with a muttered curse and rode off, leaving behind the sour scent of entitlement. That night, Clara told Jedediah. He listened quietly, jaw working under his beard, eyes burning low. He didn't speak of revenge or anger. Instead, he began reinforcing the fence the next morning, digging the posts deeper, stringing wire tighter. Clara helped, side by side, both knowing without saying that danger now had a face and a name. Their bond deepened not through grand gestures but through survival. When Jedediah came home late with a twisted ankle, Clara wrapped it in boiled cloths and propped his foot up by the fire. When Clara cut her palm on a broken jar, he cleaned it with such tenderness that she cried, not from pain, but from the sheer gentleness of it. They had no need for declarations. Their love grew like roots under soil, silent, unseen, but impossible to tear out. But the threat wasn't gone. It never really left. Weeks later, the warning came in the form of a dead rabbit nailed to their door. Not killed for food, killed for message. Jedediah stared at it for a long time, then gently took it down, wrapped it in cloth, and buried it beneath the cottonwood tree. "They want fear," he said. "We won't give it to them." But Clara did feel fear. Not for herself, but for the home they were building, for the man who had given her more peace in 6 months than all her years combined. She'd known cruelty in whispers, in backhanded blessings, in the cold stare of judgmental matrons. But this was different. This was violence waiting for an open door. That night, as the wind howled through the eaves and the fire cracked low, Clara looked at Jedediah and spoke what had rested heavy on her chest. "They want to break us." He looked at her, his hand wrapped around hers. "Then we don't bend." The resolve in his voice wasn't loud, but it echoed deeper than any sermon she'd ever heard. And in that moment, something inside her settled. Not because the danger was gone, but because she wasn't alone to face it. They sat that night watching the dark, listening to the quiet rustle of the prairie and the soft beat of their hearts in sync. There would be more riders, more warnings, maybe even worse. But Clara knew what she had not known before. Love wasn't about safety. It was about choosing someone to walk through the fire with, and she had chosen well. The wind that once danced gently across the prairie now screamed like a warning from the earth itself. It began with the sky, bleeding into rust-colored clouds as if heaven had swallowed smoke. Clara stood outside the cabin, her shawl pulled tight across her shoulders, eyes fixed on the horizon where dark riders emerged like specters. Jedediah stepped beside her, rifle in hand, jaw set. No words passed between them. They didn't need them. The past had caught up. 3 men, faces half hidden by bandanas, rode hard through the dust. One held a bottle. One had a rope slung over his saddle. The last one, the tallest, had eyes as empty as burned-out lanterns. Clara recognized him before Jedediah did. Gentry Malone. He was a name Jedediah had buried, a ghost from Texas plains who once rode beside him in bloodier days, before cattle and quiet dreams. Gentry had no use for peace. He lived for chaos, for taking what others loved and tearing it apart. And now, he had found the only thing Jedediah had ever truly cared for. Clara didn't flinch as they stopped a few feet from the porch. Jedediah stepped in front of her without hesitation. "Well, well," Gentry said, dismounting. His voice slithered like a snake through tall grass. "Didn't think I'd find you playing house with a preacher's daughter. Ain't that something?" Jedediah kept his eyes steady. "You got no business here, Gentry." "Oh, but I do. You owe me. You walked away and took more than your share. I came for what's mine." His gaze slid to Clara, and Jedediah raised the rifle. "Don't," he said. The next seconds were stretched thin with tension. Then, Gentry smiled, cold and slow. "Let's settle this proper," he said. "Out past Devil's Hollow. 1 hour. Bring your courage, Boone. You always did leave it behind when it counted." They turned and rode off without another word, their laughter scattering like crows in the dusk. Inside, the fire crackled but gave no warmth. Clara paced while Jedediah packed his old saddlebag, rope, ammo, a flask of water. She didn't cry. She didn't plead. But her voice trembled when she said, "You don't have to go." "Yes, I do," he replied. "Men like Gentry don't just leave. They burn everything until they're stopped." She reached out, fingers brushing the scar on his wrist. "And if you don't come back?" He looked at her then, really looked, as if memorizing her for the road ahead. "Then you build this place without me. You keep the soil soft. You keep the door open. You live, Clara. You make sure all this meant something." She nodded once. He kissed her forehead and walked into the night. The path to Devil's Hollow was dry and cracked, lit only by the stars and the brittle whisper of wind through dying trees. Jedediah rode like a man walking toward judgment, not revenge. He didn't pray. He didn't curse. He just remembered. Every mistake, every night alone in the cold, and every day since Clara had said yes. He arrived early. Gentry and the others were already there, 3 shadows carved from the same stone. No lawmen for miles. No witnesses but coyotes and ghosts. "You always were stupidly noble," Gentry drawled. "Ain't no one left to impress." Jedediah didn't answer. He leveled the rifle. What followed was chaos, a blur of gunshots, hooves, and snarling voices. Jedediah moved fast, dropping one man before his boot hit the ground. A bullet grazed his arm. Another ripped through his coat. The third man lunged with a knife, but Jedediah twisted, slammed the rifle butt into his jaw, and didn't look back. Then it was just Gentry. They circled like wolves, breath steaming in the cold. Gentry lunged, but Jedediah ducked, tackled him hard to the earth. Fists flew. Blood spilled. They fought not like men but like past sins fighting to survive. In the end, Jedediah stood, barely, over Gentry's broken form. He didn't finish him. He didn't need to. Gentry would crawl back into the hole he came from, or the prairie would swallow him whole. Jedediah staggered to his horse, wound bleeding, ribs cracked. He rode slow, the night stretching long and merciless. Clara heard the horse before she saw it. She ran out, heart thudding, breath held like a final prayer. When she saw him slumped in the saddle, she didn't scream. She just reached up, helped him down, and half dragged him into the cabin. He faded in and out for 2 days, fevered and broken. She cleaned every wound, whispered psalms into his sleep, and held his hand like a lifeline. When he woke, weak but smiling, she wept into his chest. "I told you I'd come back," he rasped. And so he had. Word spread slowly. That the cowboy had faced down death for love. That the preacher's daughter had built a home with her own hands. And that maybe, just maybe, the prairie gave back when you gave it everything. Those who once mocked her now watched with quiet awe as the garden grew outside their cabin. As Clara walked through town, chin high, hand in his. As Jedediah, once a ghost of violence, tipped his hat not in apology, but in peace. They never had much. No gold. No fine dresses. No crystal chandeliers or ballroom music. But they had mornings by the fire. Laughter under the stars. A kitchen that smelled of biscuits and wild sage. And the kind of silence that meant safety, not sorrow. He gave her everything that mattered. And the prairie, at last, called her one of its own. The morning broke in streaks of silver and ash, light creeping slowly across the wounded horizon. Clara stood by the front window, steam curling from the chipped tin mug in her hands. She hadn't slept. Neither had Jedediah. He sat by the fire, rifle across his knees, his face drawn in hard lines, eyes fixed on the door. Something had shifted in the past week. The silence of the land had changed, no longer patient, but tense, as if holding its breath. They knew the final move was coming. Harlan Dobbs had been seen in the next town over, bragging with drink-stained breath about Boone's stolen ranch, whispering to anyone who'd listen that justice would come soon. Not the law's justice. His own brand. Clara didn't need to be told what that meant. She'd lived among men who saw cruelty as a form of order. But this time, she wasn't just watching it happen to someone else. This time, the fire was on her porch. Jedediah shifted, pressing a hand to his still-healing side. The wound from last week's ambush had left him slower, but not broken. He caught her looking. "You should leave," he said quietly. "No. They'll come tonight. I feel it. Then I'll be here when they do." Her voice was steady, not defiant. Just true. It startled him, the clarity of it, and he realized then what had been growing between them wasn't just love. It was a shared defiance. The kind you stake your life on. They spent the day preparing, not for survival, but for the stand. Clara reinforced the hinges on the back door, while Jedediah set extra firewood by the window slit. Every movement was deliberate. Not out of fear. Out of resolve. As the sun dipped low and the shadows lengthened, they lit only one lamp, leaving the rest of the cabin in darkness. Outside, the prairie was silent. No wind, no crickets, not even the rustle of dry grass. It was the kind of silence that comes before thunder. Then hooves. 6 of them, maybe more. No torches, just dark figures on horseback, outlined by moonlight like sketches drawn in haste. Clara's pulse didn't quicken. It slowed, every beat anchoring her to the floor. The men dismounted slowly, fanning out like they'd done this before. One stepped forward. "Harlan." His voice came low and lazy. "Boone. You in there? Thought we'd come pay a friendly visit." Jedediah didn't answer. His finger rested lightly on the trigger. "We just want what's fair. This land ain't yours. You don't got the kind of name that holds property. You barely got a name at all. Still no answer. Harlan's tone shifted, mockery turning to steel. Last chance, Boone. You come out now, we let the girl walk. That was the moment Clara stepped forward, pressing her palm gently to Jedediah's shoulder. Let me speak, she whispered. He shook his head once, but her eyes held him. Not pleading, just certain. She stepped outside before he could stop her, rifle resting casually in her arms. The men watched her, stunned. A woman in a night dress and boots, hair loose around her shoulders, face lit only by the cold gleam of the moon. You came here to threaten a man for building something with his own hands, she said, voice clear. You ride with numbers, thinking it gives you power. But all I see are cowards. Harlan shifted, hand twitching near his belt. You think you scare me, girl? No, she said. But I know something that should. And then Jedediah stepped out behind her, slow, steady. Not hiding. Not trembling. Just there, weathered, wounded, unyielding. You were right, Harlan, he said. I ain't got a name that buys land. I got a name that earned it. In the next breath, everything changed. One of the men reached for his revolver. Jedediah raised his rifle. 2 shots cracked the stillness, echoing like a hammer against stone. Dust flew. Hooves scrambled. One rider fell hard. The others pulled back, caught between pride and self-preservation. Clara didn't move. Her aim was steady, pointed at the rider to Harlan's left. This is our home, she said. If you ride again, you won't get to ride back. Harlan glared at them both, rage clenching his jaw. But his hands stayed empty. He knew the line had shifted, and that he'd already lost. He turned his horse. The others followed, shadows shrinking as they vanished into the dark. When silence returned, it felt earned. Heavy with meaning. Clara lowered the rifle slowly. Jedediah turned to her, eyes soft despite everything. You were braver than I was, he said. No, she replied. I just finally became who I was always meant to be. They buried the dead rider before dawn, no ceremony, just earth and sweat and a prayer whispered under breath. When the sun rose, it cast gold across the porch, across the bloodied boards and the broken ground. Clara made coffee. Jedediah sat beside her, shoulder to shoulder, neither speaking. There were no promises made, no dramatic proclamations, only the quiet knowing that they had won something no one could take. Later that day, the sheriff came, heard the story, looked at the grave and then at the faces of the 2 who had stayed. Won't be bothering you again, he said simply. Not after what folks are saying. Clara nodded. Jedediah didn't respond. The sheriff tipped his hat and rode on. In the weeks that followed, no one came. The garden grew again. The chickens returned. Clara painted the door frame yellow, and Jedediah carved a second name beside hers. His own, finally etched in wood with pride. They had nothing the world would call rich. But they had peace, and each other, and the knowledge that love, when earned through fire and held through storms, doesn't need permission to last. Because in the end, he gave her more than land or safety or shelter. He gave her everything that mattered.